When it comes to discussing the Hit and Brenner eras of Thomas and Friends, they each get a different reception. Most people say that the Hit era was inconsistent with its characters and rarely wrote correctly for them, whereas the Brenner era is loved for bringing back fan favourites and sticking true to their original personas. However, I don't fully agree with these statements, and today I'm going to tell you a tale about the time a Hit era episode outstripped a Brenner one, those two being Duncan in the Old Mine and No Steam Without Coal. Let's get into it. Season 9 is a criminally underrated season. Upon my most recent rewatch of it, I found that there were a lot of great episodes. Yes, there were bad episodes as well, but there were also a lot of episodes that felt like they were written by people who knew how to write for this show. I could list a load of examples, but one that always stuck out to me was Duncan and the Old Mine. I've talked about this episode before in my Hidden Gems of the Hit Era video, but I really didn't get across just how fantastic it is. I, like many others, believe it to be one of the best Season 9 episodes, but not for the reason you think. Whenever I hear anyone discuss this episode, they always just talk about the model work. I do agree that the sets of the mine and the cliffs are very well made, but what I appreciate more is the writing. This episode is the only time outside of the classic era that used the Rusty and Duncan duo, which is strong fan service on its own, but that's not all. It didn't just bring the dynamic back, but also massively improved upon it, and used it to tell an excellent story. The same cannot be said for No Steam Without Coal, the worst episode of Season 18 without a shadow of a doubt. Whilst the Brenner era had a lot of strong writing, and was mostly great for its returnees, No Steam Without Coal did the opposite of what Duncan and the Old Mine did. It gave some spotlight to Bill and Ben, who were nice to see again in Season 17, but the episode actually ruined their characters, and told what I would say is a terrible story. Here's a hot take for you. I hold Season 9 above the whole Brenner era. The main reason why I think this is because it often did things that weren't done before with the characters and stories, whereas the Brenner era tended to keep things the way they had been. Let's explain in more detail.
I feel his personality isn't right. He's too nice.
I respectfully disagree with you, Tug. Season 9 fixes all of the issues that I had with Duncan in the last comparison video. My main gripe with him is that he's nothing new when it comes to the jerk character. Every single one of his classic episodes is about him being a jerk and acting like an utter twat. But no matter how much comeuppance he receives, he never learns his lesson and always resets back to zero in his next episode. A bit like Norman Price in CGI Fireman Sam. In Duncan in the Old Mine though, he actually shows a sign of development for the first time. When he's told that he won't be going to Culdy Caves, nice name drop there, he's disappointed, but for once he doesn't throw a strop and just gets over it.
Finally!
But even then, Duncan isn't fully developed and still has some distance to cover, as this episode shows. When he sees a barrier blocking an old track and an abandoned mine shaft, he lets curiosity get the better of him. But unlike in the classic era, this episode gets us to relate to him. In seasons 4 through 7, whenever Duncan broke the rules, he was always portrayed as a horrible antagonistic figure that deserves the death sentence, but season 9 was different. The episode still acknowledges the foolishness of him going into the tunnel and making the roof collapse, which was a very clever nod to Home at Last by the way, but it also shows Duncan's motivations. He's bored of pulling coal trucks all day and wants to do something new and exciting. His desire for adventure is one that we as kids could all relate to, and as a result, the audience actually roots for Duncan and doesn't fully disapprove of his actions. This character goes in contrast to Bill and Ben in No Steam Without Coal. These two twats are the main reason as to why I despise this episode. The story revolves around them acting incredibly inconsiderate until the clay pits runs out of coal thanks to them. Their only hope is Timothy, whom they made fun of because he uses oil instead of coal. Many say that this is in character for them and that it's a good story with strong dynamics. However, I disagree heavily with all of that. Bill and Ben were cheeky and boisterous in the classic era, but it rarely went to a point where they were insufferable, with some exceptions like One Good Turn and Buffer Bother. However, they did know when to cop on and act responsibly, as can be seen in Heroes, and they were usually respectful towards the other engines. But No Steam Without Coal is a massive contradiction to that. Throughout the episode, they constantly misbehave and never once think of the consequences of their actions. From the start, they're too busy racing each other to focus on their own jobs, and when they're at the clay pits, they're just as unbearable and show a complete disregard to Timothy and Marion's complaints. To me, this is character regression for them. The only time they ever rebelled like this was in Bill, Ben and Fergus in Season 7. But in that episode, they were jerks like that because Fergus was made out to be just as flawed as they were. But when their actions caused a landslide, they realised what they had done and they showed they were sorry, and I could tell they meant it, because I don't think it's a coincidence that they appear numerous times in the hit era, yet they don't mess around at all. In this episode though, they don't take responsibility for anything and cause a lot of inconvenience for the others. Not to mention that they're downright cruel to Timothy. Whenever he tells them to behave, politely I might add, Bill and Ben just abuse him by calling him boring and pointing out that he's different. Again, they would never do that in the classic series. They would if Timothy was bad in any way to them, but he isn't. Unlike Fergus, he has no flaws, and that's another thing I hate about No Steam Without Coal. It's no secret that I'm not a fan of characters that are nothing more than a plot device to make a story's moral as obvious as possible, and Timothy is just that. While his design is incredibly fascinating, its only use is to tell the basic moral of not judging by appearances. That's a nice moral, but hasn't it been done countless times before this? So Timothy was wasted potential, and why Brenner didn't take the opportunity to bring back Boko or Fergus is beyond me. But even though Timothy is a bad deuteragonist to Bill and Ben, Rusty's similar role in Duncan and the Old Mine certainly isn't. In the likes of Rock and Roll, Rusty suffers from the same problem as Timothy. He's your average nice guy who's hard-working and will always help his friends. He's no different to characters like Toby, Duck, Boko, Edward, the list goes on. But Hit improved upon this by giving him flaws to make his character more interesting. I actually like the episode's tuneful toots in Which Way Now. They both add realistic flaws to his character, such as insecurity and impatience, but they don't completely Flanderise him, the way they did with Skarloey and Rheneas. Not only did he make mistakes in those episodes, but he was also smart enough to solve them. There were also some episodes that got his classic persona perfect, such as Skarloey the Brave, and especially Duncan and the Old Mine. The scene where he and Duncan argue at the start is very clever. Normally, Rusty is just an average voice of reason character that exists so Duncan can learn the lesson of the episode. Here though, Rusty is no more flawed than Duncan is. Even though he's right about putting work before play, the episode seems to portray him as a sort of spoilsport rather than a saint. However, this was intentional. I've said this before, but what I love the most about seasons 8 through 10 is how often it makes us see both sides of an argument between characters, and this episode is no exception. Since we've seen and understood Duncan's longing for excitement, Rusty shutting down his opportunity for some makes us root for Duncan even more, and you can see why he went down the old track anyway. And because of that, seeing him show Rusty the coal trucks he found in the mine is very satisfying, as it's the closest we'll ever get to Duncan being right and Rusty being wrong. But instead, they're both partially right and wrong at the same time, and that's what leads me to the main reason as to why this episode rocks: the complex moral. If this episode was from the classic or Brenner eras, Duncan would just get stuck, Rusty would rescue him and bring him to Mr. Percival, who would punish Duncan. But no, Season 9 could not abide with one-dimensional writing. Whilst Rusty is portrayed as a sort of killjoy at the start, the episode is aware that he means well. The only reason he told Duncan off is because he doesn't want him to get into trouble. When Duncan causes the roof to collapse, Rusty's words are proven right. Rusty cares for Duncan, and this is also shown when Duncan goes missing and Rusty makes it his mission to find him. But while it was right for Rusty to be responsible and call Duncan out, the story shows that Duncan's adventure had more benefits than detriments. Not only did he find coal trucks in the mine, but he also learned to be smarter from it. When Duncan enters the tunnel, he's careless and doesn't think before he acts, which causes the roof to collapse. At first he freaks out and is ready to give up, but when he finds some coal trucks, he regains composure and starts to find a way out. And when he reaches the end, he's much wiser and knows to think more clearly, so when he sees a boarded exit, he doesn't panic and instead comes up with a plan to bash his way out. So when a worried Rusty finds him, he can't scold Duncan, because all he can see is Duncan pushing some coal trucks, which is what he had been assigned to do. I've heard some people complain about the fact that Duncan doesn't get properly punished for his actions in this episode, but they're missing the point. Duncan did learn his lesson from his own experience, instead of getting a generic confusion and delay lecture from the Thin Controller. Season 9 did this a lot, with some other examples being Mighty Mac and Thomas in the New Engine. That's my main gripe with the likes of Season 21, where most episodes consist of characters acting like idiots until they're called out by someone else. Speaking of which, Mr. Percival is characterised perfectly too. He's not shy about Duncan's recklessness being wrong, but he's also aware of the benefits of the escapade. That's what this episode's moral is. Stepping out of your comfort zone can be dangerous, but it's also important for growth. If Duncan had just listened to Rusty and did his job as normal, he wouldn't have gained any new knowledge, nor would he have found any valuable coal. I also really commend the way this episode builds on tension. Duncan being trapped is bad enough, but when he tries calling for help only to receive nothing, the stakes get higher. And when he hits what he thinks are buffers, all hope seems lost. All these moments of tension make the revelation that the buffers are actually trucks so relieving, and when Duncan escapes, you can't feel happier for him. This episode does everything right, and gets a solid 10 out of 10 for me, and yet it isn't even in my top 5 Season 9 episodes. No Steam Without Coal can't claim the same. Not only is its moral extremely bog standard, but the episode has all the assets of a bad generic episode. Unlikable protagonists, a blank slate of a deuteragonist, and a one-dimensional moral that's been done to death. The episode takes what feels like half an hour to get to the moral, and also steals the plot of the Season 8 episode Thomas to the Rescue, an episode that does the narrative so much better. What's worse is that Bill and Ben don't learn anything from this episode. They continue to bully Timothy in Season 19, and the way they apologise to him is really forced, and they just laugh it off as a joke. This makes the moral of the story a lot less serious than it should be, and I really hate that. I like Season 18, and it has a lot more great episodes than poor ones, but when it came to writing, Season 9 outstrips it and the other Brenner seasons. While the Brenner era was much more consistent with its characters, it tended to keep them in the same place they had been in the classic series, which resulted in rather basic storytelling. Season 9, on the other hand, had very original concepts and complex stories, and did this by doing new things with its characters. Duncan and the Old Mine improved upon Rusty and Duncan's bland duo from the classic era, and this created a strong story about adventure. This is the same reason why I love Saving Edward. Sure, Edward's character in the episode was debatable, but I can forgive it because it was a fantastic study of his friendship with Thomas. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I prefer Season 9 to Season 4. I am aware that it has bad episodes, but on my latest rewatch, there were only 2 episodes that I actually hated, those being Renaissance the Dinosaur and Scarloey the Brave. But if you get rid of them and a few meh ones like Thomas and the Birthday Picnic and Toby Feels Left Out, you get a lot of great episodes, be they simply decent or downright fantastic. Season 9 is really not as bad as people make it out to be. In conclusion, Duncan and the Old Mine is amazing for improving upon 2 of my least favourite classic characters and telling a strong story that had never been told before. No Steam Without Coal is the antithesis of this. It tried bringing back Bill and Ben's characters, but went too far with them, and didn't succeed much story-wise with an unoriginal moral and a bland new character. Season 18 is a great season nonetheless, but it still has duds, and it doesn't really compare to Season 9 for me. And that's that. If you thought my first episode of Thomas Compared was controversial, then this one is something else. However, there has been a lot of passion behind this one, since Season 9 is my most nostalgic season, and Duncan and the Old Mine has always been one of my favourite episodes. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Thomas Compared. There are more videos on the way, and if you're interested in seeing them, consider subscribing and enjoy the rest of your day.